The family I nanny for has an escape tunnel under the garage, and this morning we had 90 seconds to reach it. I started working for the Ashford family in October after answering a posting that offered nearly 3 times what other nannying positions in the area paid. The job description had been oddly specific about requirements: extensive background check mandatory, emergency medical certification required, physical fitness assessment needed, willingness to relocate on short notice essential, and most strangely, comfort with non-traditional security protocols. Most childcare positions didn't read like applications for a special forces unit, but I needed the money desperately after my mother's medical bills had drained everything I'd saved, and the salary they offered would let me pay off debt and actually start building a future. When I met Elena Ashford for the first time at a neutral location downtown, she spent the first hour asking questions that had nothing to do with childcare experience or educational philosophy. She wanted to know how I handled extreme stress, whether I'd ever had to make life or death decisions, if I had family or close relationships that might complicate sudden schedule changes, what my pain tolerance was like, whether I had any military or law enforcement background. I answered honestly while increasingly convinced this was either an elaborate prank or something illegal, but Elena's demeanor suggested neither. She was in her early 40s with silver streaking through dark hair pulled back severely, dressed in clothes that looked expensive but deliberately understated, and she carried herself with the controlled tension of someone always calculating exit routes. She explained that her husband Gabriel worked in international corporate security consulting, and their work occasionally required extreme privacy measures and rapid relocations. They had 3 children, 11-year-old Lucia, 8-year-old Mateo, and 5-year-old Daniela, all of whom had been raised with certain protocols that might seem unusual to outsiders, but were necessary for their safety. Elena said their previous nanny had been with them for 6 years before retiring, and they needed someone who could commit long-term and understand that this position required absolute discretion and unwavering composure under pressure. She asked if I had any hesitation about those requirements, and I told her honestly that I wasn't sure what I was signing up for, but I was willing to learn. She studied me for a long moment with eyes that seemed to see through every defense I'd ever constructed, then said she'd need to conduct the background check and verify my references, but assuming everything cleared, I could start the following Monday. The salary she quoted was even higher than the posting had indicated, with additional hazard pay and bonuses for any emergency situations that required extended hours or unusual circumstances. I left that meeting feeling like I'd just agreed to something I didn't fully understand, but the money was too substantial to walk away from. The Ashford house was in one of those gated communities where every property looked like it cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Sprawling modern architecture with perfect landscaping and the kind of privacy that came from having acres between you and your nearest neighbors. From the outside, it appeared completely normal, beautiful, but not ostentatious, the kind of home successful professionals might own. But when Elena gave me the tour on my first day, I started noticing things that weren't normal at all. Every window had steel shutters that could drop in seconds with the press of a button. The front and back doors were reinforced steel disguised to look like wood, with biometric locks requiring both fingerprint and retinal scans. There were panic buttons in every room, cameras covering every angle of the property including thermal imaging for the perimeter, and a central monitoring station in Gabriel's office that looked like something from a military command center. Elena programmed my biometrics into the system and explained that only 5 people had full access to the house. Her, Gabriel, me, their head of security named Vincent Reyes, who I'd meet later, and the previous nanny whose access would be deactivated by end of week. The children had restricted access codes that allowed them into certain areas, but triggered alerts if they tried to leave the property without adult authorization. She said this casually while showing me how to arm and disarm various security zones, like she was explaining how to use a particularly complicated coffee maker, rather than a system that belonged in a government facility. Then she took me down to the garage, which housed 4 vehicles including an armored SUV that Elena said I'd use for any transportation with the children. She walked to the back corner near the workbench and pressed a sequence on what looked like a standard electrical panel. A section of the concrete floor began descending like an elevator platform, revealing stairs that led down into darkness. Elena flipped a switch and lights illuminated a tunnel that stretched far beyond where I could see. Concrete walls and ceiling with LED strips providing even illumination, and what looked like ventilation grates at regular intervals. She said this was the emergency evacuation route, and if she or Gabriel ever gave the code phrase, Protocol Amber, I had exactly 90 seconds to get all 3 children into this tunnel and seal the entrance behind us. The tunnel led to a bunker approximately 1 mile from the house, stocked with supplies for extended stays, and with its own separate exit point into undeveloped land, where vehicles were pre-positioned for further evacuation if necessary. She made me practice the route to memorize the entrance sequence, showed me how to seal the tunnel door from inside, and explained that once sealed, the entrance would be virtually undetectable from above, and could withstand significant force. I asked what scenario would require us to use an escape tunnel, and Elena's expression went completely blank in a way that was more frightening than any answer she could have given. She said Gabriel's work had made them targets in the past, nothing I needed to worry about in detail, but they believed in being prepared for worst-case scenarios. The tunnel had never been used in an emergency, but they drilled the children monthly to keep the protocols fresh. Then she showed me the rest of the security measures. Safe rooms in 3 different locations throughout the house, each stocked with medical supplies and communication equipment, weapons lockers that only she and Gabriel could access, emergency supplies cached in strategic locations, and a sophisticated alert system that could detect intruders at multiple perimeter points. She walked me through various threat scenarios and the appropriate responses for each, and by the time we finished, I felt like I'd been hired to protect the president, rather than care for 3 elementary-aged children. Elena asked if I was having second thoughts, and I told her honestly that everything seemed excessive, but I understood some people lived with threats I couldn't comprehend. She nodded and said I'd meet the children at pickup time, and hopefully once I got to know them, I'd understand why all of this was necessary. Lucia, Matteo, and Daniela were quiet children who seemed older than their years in ways that made my chest ache. Lucia had her mother's dark coloring and watchful eyes, already carrying herself with a seriousness that no 11-year-old should need. Matteo was small for 8 with glasses that made him look scholarly, and he had a habit of scanning every room before entering. Daniela was tiny and delicate with curls that bounced when she moved, but even at 5 she had been trained not to talk to strangers and to always stay within arm's reach of authorized adults. All 3 were polite to the point of being formal, saying please and thank you for everything, and asking permission before taking snacks or changing activities. That first afternoon, I made them a snack and helped with homework while they sized me up with the careful evaluation of children who'd learned not to trust easily. Matteo asked me if I knew how to do emergency first aid, and when I confirmed I was certified, he looked relieved in a way that broke something inside me. Daniela wanted to know if I'd practiced the tunnel route, and seemed satisfied when I told her I'd done it 3 times that morning. Lucia asked point blank if I was planning to stay long term, or if I'd leave like some of the temporary staff they'd had before the previous nanny, and I told her honestly that I planned to stay as long as they needed me. She studied me with eyes too old for her face, and said they'd had 6 different people in the past year, before Elena found someone permanent, and it was hard to keep saying goodbye. I promised I wouldn't leave without warning, and she accepted this with a small nod that suggested she'd learned to take promises with skepticism. Over the following weeks, I fell into routines with the children and learned the rhythms of the household. Gabriel was rarely home, traveling constantly for his security consulting work, and when he was there, he spent most of his time in his office or in meetings with Vincent and other serious-looking people who arrived in unmarked vehicles. Elena worked from a home office doing something with encrypted communications and secure data analysis, emerging periodically to check on the children, but mostly trusting me to handle their daily care. The kids were homeschooled with a rigorous curriculum that included not just standard academics, but also physical training, multiple languages, conflict resolution, and what Elena called situational awareness skills that were basically advanced threat assessment for children. Twice a week, a self-defense instructor came to teach them age-appropriate techniques, and once a week they had sessions with a therapist who specialized in children living with security concerns. I asked Elena if this level of preparation was healthy for kids, and she looked at me with an expression mixing sadness and steel, saying she wished they could have normal childhoods, but normal wasn't an option when your father's testimony had put 3 international crime syndicates in prison. That was the first time anyone had directly explained what made the Ashford family targets. Gabriel had worked as a forensic accountant and security consultant who specialized in tracking money laundering and financial crimes, and over the past decade he'd provided evidence that led to the collapse of multiple criminal organizations and the seizure of billions in illegal assets. The people he'd helped imprison had resources and reach that extended across continents, and they'd made clear their intentions to retaliate against him and his family. There had been incidents over the years, surveillance they'd detected, break-in attempts at previous homes, a kidnapping threat that never materialized but was credible enough to take seriously, indirect threats delivered through intermediaries, and once, a car bomb that had been discovered before detonation because Gabriel's security team swept their vehicles daily. Elena said they'd lived this way for 8 years, moving every 18 months to 2 years when they detected surveillance or threat indicators increased, maintaining multiple layers of security and always having exit strategies prepared. The children had never known normal life. They'd never attended public school, never had friends over without extensive background checks on the families, never been to birthday parties or public events without security presence, never been able to share photos on social media or talk about their lives with anyone outside their secured circle. Elena's voice cracked slightly when she said she and Gabriel had considered going into official witness protection, but Gabriel's expertise was too valuable to too many ongoing investigations, and law enforcement agencies kept pulling pulling him in for new cases. So they built their own version of protection with private security firms, rotating safe houses, and constant vigilance. She said she was telling me this because I deserved to understand what I'd signed up for, and if I wanted to leave, she'd understand completely, and still pay me through the end of the month. But if I stayed, I needed to commit fully to the protocols and understand that the elaborate security wasn't paranoia. It was the minimum necessary to keep her children alive. I told Elena I was staying. The money was still a factor, but something deeper had taken hold. Those 3 children with their too careful manners and too old eyes had grabbed onto something in my chest, and the thought of leaving them felt impossible. Over the next 3 months, I became part of their security ecosystem, learning to recognize the subtle signs that Vincent's team watched for, understanding the layers of monitoring and response that operated invisibly around us at all times. Vincent himself was a former military operator who'd worked executive protection for a decade, before Gabriel hired him to build a comprehensive security program for his family. He was professional and thorough, treating me as part of the team rather than just the nanny, and he made sure I understood not just the what of our protocols, but the why behind every measure. He explained that the greatest vulnerabilities in any security program were predictability and complacency, which is why they varied routes and schedules constantly, why they had multiple layers of seemingly redundant protection, why they drilled the family on emergency responses even when threat levels were low. He said the tunnel had been his idea, installed when they'd moved to this house 2 years ago, because every security plan needed a last resort option that couldn't be compromised by someone with inside knowledge or by sophisticated surveillance. Only 6 people knew the tunnel existed: Elena, Gabriel, Vincent, me, the construction team lead who'd built it and who was also ex-military and bound by ironclad NDAs, and the previous nanny. The children knew about it, but not its exact location or mechanism, which was intentional so they couldn't accidentally reveal it under pressure or interrogation. Vincent said he hoped we'd never need it, but in his experience, the things you prepared for most carefully were the things that kept you alive when everything else failed. The months passed without incident, and I started to relax into thinking maybe the threats were more theoretical than real. Maybe the criminal organizations had moved on to other targets. Maybe all this security was just expensive insurance that would never pay out. The children thrived under consistent care and began opening up emotionally. Lucia started smiling more and talking about things besides security protocols. Mateo's anxiety decreased enough that he could sleep without nightmares most nights. And Daniela became affectionate and playful in ways Elena said she hadn't been in years. We celebrated Daniela's 6th birthday with a party that included 3 carefully vetted families from their therapist's practice. And watching her blow out candles while genuinely happy made me understand viscerally why Elena and Gabriel had built such elaborate protection around these kids. They deserved joy in childhood despite the threats that shadowed their lives, and every moment of normalcy was a victory against the people who wanted to hurt them. Then Vincent detected surveillance. It started with small anomalies, vehicles that appeared too frequently in neighborhood traffic patterns, a utility worker whose credentials didn't match the company's actual staffing records, electronic signals that suggested someone was attempting to map their wireless network. Vincent increased security measures quietly, adding patrols and expanding the monitoring perimeter, and he briefed Elena and me on elevated protocols without alarming the children. Gabriel was overseas finishing testimony in another case, scheduled to return in 3 days, and Vincent said we needed to consider whether to relocate immediately or wait for Gabriel's return. Elena decided to wait because moving while Gabriel was absent meant splitting the family, and previous experience had taught them that was more dangerous than maintaining their secure position. Vincent accepted her decision but insisted on additional measures: armed security on the property 24/7, restricted movement for the children with all activities moved inside the house, and everyone sleeping in the safe room on the 2nd floor rather than in regular bedrooms. The children picked up on the tension immediately despite our efforts to maintain normalcy. Lucia asked me directly if something was wrong, and I told her honestly that Vincent had detected possible surveillance and we were being extra careful until Gabriel got home. She accepted this with a calm that suggested she'd been through similar situations before, and I watched her take on a protective role with her younger siblings, keeping them entertained and distracted while the adults managed the security response. Mateo became quieter and more watchful, and Daniela stopped asking to play outside, all of them shifting into the careful survival mode they'd been trained for since they were old enough to understand their lives weren't normal. Vincent's surveillance detection team identified 3 separate observation points around the property and confirmed at least 2 individuals conducting sustained surveillance with professional-grade equipment. He briefed Elena and me that this represented a credible immediate threat and recommended implementing evacuation protocols within the next 6 hours. Elena tried calling Gabriel but couldn't reach him, which Vincent said wasn't unusual given he was traveling in regions with limited secure communications. She made the decision to prepare for evacuation, but wait until morning to move the children, gambling that whoever was watching them would wait for Gabriel's return before making any move, since he was presumably the primary target. Vincent disagreed and said that assumption was dangerous, that sometimes families were targeted specifically to pressure or punish the primary, but he deferred to Elena's authority as the client. We spent the night in the safe room with Vincent, and 2 of his team stationed inside and another 4 positioned around the property perimeter. The children slept fitfully while Elena and I took turns keeping watch, and I found myself staring at the panic button that would trigger the tunnel evacuation, wondering if we'd actually need it or if this would turn out to be another false alarm. Morning came without incident, and Elena decided we should maintain the appearance of normalcy, while Vincent continued assessing the threat. The children had their regular lessons, and I made breakfast and tried to keep routines as normal as possible despite everyone's elevated stress. Around 10 in the morning, Vincent came to find Elena with an expression that made my stomach drop. He said his team had lost track of the surveillance positions overnight, which meant either the watchers had left or they'd gone to ground in preparation for action. He'd tried to contact Gabriel's security team and gotten no response, which was highly abnormal, and he detected what might be jamming signals affecting their communications. He said in his professional assessment they were in the final stages before an attack, and they needed to evacuate immediately using the tunnel and get to the secondary safe house he'd prepared for exactly this scenario. Elena's face went white, but her voice stayed steady when she called me over and told me to get the children ready to move. I started to ask questions, but she cut me off and said there was no time for explanations. I needed to trust Vincent's assessment and follow the evacuation protocols we'd drilled. I gathered the children from their lessons and told them calmly that we were doing a protocol amber drill, using the code phrase that meant tunnel evacuation, and I needed them to move quickly and quietly. Lucia's eyes went sharp with understanding, and she helped Mateo put on his shoes while I grabbed Daniela. Elena had already gone to get emergency bags from the safe room, pre-packed backpacks for each family member with documents, cash, medications, and essential supplies. Vincent was on his radio coordinating with his team, and I could hear the tension in his voice as he gave rapid instructions about securing the perimeter and preparing fallback positions. We were moving toward the garage when Vincent's radio erupted with urgent warnings. His perimeter team reported multiple vehicles approaching at high speed on the access road, at least 8 men visible with weapons, and they were preparing to breach the main gate. Vincent grabbed Elena and said we had maybe 90 seconds before hostile entry, and we needed to get to the tunnel immediately. Elena looked at him and asked about his team, and he said they'd delay the attackers as long as possible and then retreat to preset fallback positions. But our priority was getting the children into the tunnel and sealed away before anyone knew it existed. We ran for the garage, and I was carrying Daniela while Lucia and Mateo sprinted ahead with Elena. Vincent stayed near the door from the house into the garage, speaking into his radio and coordinating the defensive response from his team. I could hear gunfire in the distance, which meant the perimeter team had engaged the attackers. Elena reached the electrical panel and punched in the access sequence with shaking hands while I counted seconds in my head. The floor section began descending, and she pushed the children toward the stairs, telling them to go down quickly and carefully. More gunfire, closer now, and the sound of breaking glass from somewhere in the house. Vincent appeared in the garage doorway and said they'd breached the house, and we needed to seal the tunnel now. Elena hesitated, looking at Vincent, and he said his team would buy as much time as they could, but we couldn't wait. She pushed me toward the tunnel entrance and said to take the children and go. She'd be right behind us. I started down the stairs with Daniela still in my arms, and Lucia and Mateo ahead of me, their faces pale but controlled. Behind me I heard Elena and Vincent exchanging rapid words. I couldn't make out over the sounds of chaos from inside the house. I was halfway down the tunnel stairs when I heard an explosion from above that made the concrete walls shudder. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and the lights flickered but held. The children were at the bottom of the stairs waiting for me, and I got them moving into the tunnel proper, deeper into the concrete corridor that stretched ahead. I turned back to look for Elena and saw her coming down the stairs moving fast, and behind her, Vincent was operating the controls to seal the entrance. The floor section was rising back into place, and I could see into the garage for just a few more seconds before it closed completely. In that brief window, I saw armed men in tactical gear entering the garage, and Vincent raising a weapon to fire, and then the floor sealed shut with a heavy thunk that cut off all sound from above. Elena reached the bottom of the stairs and immediately went to a control panel on the tunnel wall, punching in codes that activated additional seals and security measures. The children had stopped about 20 feet into the tunnel, and I herded them further along, trying to keep them moving while my mind was still processing what I'd just seen. I asked Elena if Vincent had made it into the tunnel, and she shook her head without looking at me, her face rigid with suppressed emotion. She said Vincent's job was to secure our escape and delay pursuit, and he'd known the risks when he took this position. Her voice cracked on those last words, and I realized Vincent hadn't been just her security chief. There was history there, personal connection, and she'd just watched him choose to stay behind to buy us time. She took a shuddering breath and said we needed to keep moving. The bunker was still half a mile ahead, and we wouldn't be safe until we were sealed inside it. We moved through the tunnel at a quick walk, Elena leading with a flashlight even though the LED strips provided adequate lighting, and I brought up the rear with my arms around the younger children. The tunnel was claustrophobic despite being reasonably sized, concrete walls pressing in and the air cool and slightly stale, despite the ventilation system. Lucia walked beside her mother without speaking, her small hand clutched in Elena's, and I could see she was processing what had just happened with the two-adult understanding that came from years of preparation for exactly this scenario. Mateo was shaking but moving steadily, and Daniela had her face pressed against my shoulder, not crying but breathing in short, rapid bursts that suggested she was fighting panic. I kept up a stream of calm reassurances that I didn't believe myself, telling them we were safe now. Everything would be okay. We just needed to get to the bunker and wait for help. The tunnel seemed endless, stretching ahead with no visible endpoint. Just more concrete walls and LED lighting and the sound of our footsteps echoing in the enclosed space. Elena checked her phone repeatedly, even though she'd said there would be no signal this far underground, and I could see her hands trembling with adrenaline and fear and rage at the situation she'd been preparing for years, but had never truly expected to face. Behind us, through the thick concrete and multiple sealed doors, I heard a muffled explosion that made us all freeze. Elena's face went somehow more pale, and she said they were trying to breach the tunnel entrance, probably using shaped charges, but the seals were designed to withstand significant force and hide the tunnel's existence even under direct examination. She said we needed to move faster because once they realized the tunnel existed, they'd start looking for the exit point, and our best chance was to reach the bunker and secure it before anyone figured out where we'd gone. We practically ran the last section of tunnel, Elena pulling Lucia along and me carrying Daniela while Mateo stumbled beside us. The tunnel ended at a heavy steel door with another biometric lock, and Elena pressed her palm against the scanner with hands so shaky it took 3 tries to register. The door unlocked with a hydraulic hiss and swung open into a space that looked like a combination between a bomb shelter and a small apartment. There were bunks against one wall, a kitchenette area with supplies, a bathroom, a communication station with multiple monitors and equipment, and storage areas with more supplies than we could use in months. Elena ushered us all inside and sealed the door behind us, engaging multiple locks and checking the monitors that showed camera feeds from various angles around the bunker's concealed exterior entrance and the surrounding wooded area. The children collapsed onto the bunks while Elena went to the communication station and started trying to make contact with outside help. I watched her cycle through multiple channels and frequencies, hearing only static or dead air, and saw her face grow increasingly grim. She finally turned to me and said the jamming was more sophisticated than she'd expected, blocking even the hardened communication systems Gabriel had installed in the bunker. We had supplies and security, but no way to call for help or coordinate with Gabriel or law enforcement. She said there were protocols for this scenario. If we couldn't reach Gabriel within 6 hours, we'd implement the next stage of evacuation using the vehicle positioned near the bunker's exit and drive to a predetermined safe location where Gabriel would know to look for us. But she'd hoped the communication systems would work because that safe location was 8 hours away, and making the drive with 3 traumatized children while possibly being pursued was not a scenario she wanted to face. I asked Elena what she thought had happened to Vincent and his team, and she said based on the gunfire we'd heard and the explosions, they'd engaged the attackers to buy us escape time, and the fact that we'd made it to the bunker meant they'd succeeded in their mission. Her voice was professionally neutral when she said this, but I could see the cost of that neutrality in the rigid set of her shoulders and the way her hands clenched and unclenched. She'd known Vincent for 6 years, had trusted him with her family's lives, and she'd just left him to face what was likely overwhelming force alone. I wanted to tell her that wasn't her fault, that she'd made the only choice that protected her children, but I didn't have words adequate for that moment, so I just put my hand on her shoulder briefly before going to check on the kids. Lucia had her arms around both younger siblings, sitting on one of the bunks and speaking to them in low, soothing tones. Mateo was crying silently, and Daniela was pale and shaking. I sat down with them and started doing the grounding exercises their therapist had taught them for managing acute stress. Name 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can touch. Lucia joined in helping her siblings through the exercise, and gradually they all started breathing more normally, and the immediate panic receded into something more manageable. I asked if they needed anything, and Lucia said they just needed to know what was happening and what we were going to do next. So I explained as simply as I could that bad people had attacked the house, but we'd escaped through the tunnel like we'd practiced, and now we were in the safe bunker waiting to contact their father and figure out the next steps. Mateo asked if Vincent was okay, and I had to tell him I didn't know, but Vincent was very skilled and had been protecting them. Daniela wanted to know when they could go home, and I couldn't answer that because I didn't know if the house still existed or if we'd ever be able to return. Elena came over and knelt in front of her children, pulling them into a tight embrace and telling them she was so proud of how brave they'd been and how well they'd followed all their training. She said they were safe now, and she'd keep them safe, and as soon as they could reach their father, everything would be okay. The children clung to her with desperate intensity, and I turned away to give them privacy in their family moment while my own mind raced through implications I was only beginning to process. 5. We'd been in the bunker for about an hour when the monitors showed movement near the exterior entrance. Elena spotted it first and called me over to look at the camera feed showing the disguised exit point about 50 yards from the bunker itself. 3 men in tactical gear were systematically searching the wooded area, moving in a grid pattern that suggested professional military or paramilitary training. Elena's face went rigid and she said they'd found the general area somehow, probably by tracking the tunnel's route or detecting ventilation outlets or using ground-penetrating radar. She cycled through other camera angles and counted at least 6 more men spreading through the woods in search patterns. She said the bunker's entrance was extremely well concealed, but if they kept searching systematically, they'd eventually find it. And once they did, they had the tools to breach it given enough time. I asked what we should do, and Elena said we needed to implement the final evacuation protocol immediately, rather than waiting the planned 6 hours. She went to a storage locker and pulled out weapons, 2 handguns and a rifle, and I felt my stomach clench because I'd never fired a gun in my life, and the situation was escalating beyond anything I'd imagined. Elena saw my expression and said she wasn't asking me to fight, but I needed to know weapons were available if it came to that. She showed me the basic safety and operation of one of the handguns and made me practice the grip and trigger pull while she explained that the vehicle exit route would take us out through an underground passage that emerged nearly a quarter mile from the bunker in a different section of woods where a truck was hidden. If we moved now while the searchers were concentrated around the main bunker area, we might be able to reach the vehicle and escape before they realized what we were doing. I asked about the children and whether they should be exposed to that risk versus staying in the bunker, which seemed more secure. Elena said the bunker was a defensive position, but not indefinitely sustainable if attackers had time to set up siege equipment or bring in specialists to breach the fortifications. The vehicle offered mobility and the chance to reach the predetermined safe house where Gabriel would eventually look for them. She'd weighed the risks and decided movement was safer than staying static, especially since we had no communications and no way to call for help. She told me to get the children ready to move again while she prepared the vehicle access tunnel and monitored the camera feeds for optimal timing. I gathered the kids and explained we were going to take another tunnel to a hidden vehicle and then drive somewhere safe, and they accepted this with the exhausted resignation of children who'd been through too much already. Elena watched the cameras for 20 minutes, tracking the searchers' movements and waiting for a moment when they were concentrated on the wrong areas. Finally, she said this was the best opportunity we'd get, and we needed to move immediately and silently. She led us to another concealed door in the bunker's rear wall that opened into a narrower tunnel, this one sloping upward and lined with rough concrete rather than the smooth finish of the main escape route. We moved single file with Elena leading, the children in the middle, and me bringing up the rear with one of the handguns Elena had insisted I take. The tunnel was cramped and dark except for our flashlights, and I could hear the children's frightened breathing echoing off the walls. We walked for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 minutes before the tunnel ended at a ladder leading up to a hatch. Elena climbed the ladder and carefully opened the hatch, checking the area above before signaling us to follow. We emerged into thick woods in the middle of nowhere, trees and undergrowth providing cover but also limiting visibility. About 30 yards away, I could see a pickup truck hidden under camouflage netting and brush. Elena moved toward it in a low crouch, and we followed with the children staying close and quiet. My heart hammered against my ribs as I scanned the woods for any sign of the searchers, expecting at any moment to hear shouts or gunfire. We reached the truck and Elena removed the netting while I helped the children into the back seat. The truck started on the first try, which felt like a minor miracle, and Elena began driving slowly through the woods on what must have been a pre-planned route, though I couldn't see any road or path. We'd been driving for maybe 5 minutes when I heard an engine behind us, and turned to see an SUV crashing through the undergrowth in pursuit. Elena saw it in the mirror and accelerated as much as she could while still navigating the rough terrain, the truck bouncing and lurching over roots and rocks, while the children clung to the seats and each other. The SUV was faster and more maneuverable and gaining ground quickly. I could see 2 men in the front seats, and the passenger was holding something that might have been a weapon. Elena shouted at me to get the children down below the seat level and shield them with my body, and I did, pressing Mateo and Daniela into the footwell while Lucia scrunched down in the seat, and I covered as much of them as I could with my own torso. Behind us, I heard the sound of gunfire and something impacted the truck with a metallic clang. Elena was driving like someone possessed, taking turns at speeds that made the truck slide and threatening to roll, but somehow keeping us on the barely visible path through the woods. She shouted that we were almost to the paved road, and once we reached it, she could outrun them on open highway. More gunfire, and I heard a window shatter somewhere in the truck. One of the children was crying, but I couldn't tell who through the sounds of the engine and the chaos. Elena took a hard right turn that threw us all sideways, and suddenly we were on pavement, the truck's tires screeching as they found purchase on the smooth surface. Elena accelerated hard, and I felt the truck surge forward with power we hadn't been able to use in the woods. The SUV behind us made it to the road seconds later, but Elena had gotten enough of a lead that they couldn't immediately catch up. We drove for 10 minutes at speeds that made my teeth rattle, Elena taking turns seemingly at random to make us harder to follow and constantly checking the mirrors. Eventually, she turned onto a major highway and merged into traffic, and the SUV either lost us or decided pursuit was too risky with witnesses around. Elena maintained the speed limit and drove carefully now, not wanting to attract police attention, and gradually the children emerged from the footwell, and I helped them back into their seats with shaking hands. Mateo had a cut on his arm from broken glass, and Daniela wouldn't stop crying, but otherwise, we were physically intact. Emotionally was another story. All three children were traumatized and terrified, and I was barely holding myself together while trying to project calm. Elena drove for another hour before pulling into a gas station and parking at the far edge of the lot. She turned to face the children and told them she needed to make some calls and try to reach their father, and meanwhile I should take them inside to use the bathroom and get some food and drinks. She gave me cash and told me to avoid using credit cards or anything traceable, and to watch for anyone who seemed to be paying too much attention to us. I took the children into the gas station, and we must have looked like disaster survivors because the clerk asked if we needed help or if she should call someone. I told her we were fine, just a car accident that had shaken us up, and we needed to clean up a bit. She pointed us to the bathroom and said to take our time. In the bathroom, I helped the children wash their faces and hands and checked Mateo's arm, which was a superficial cut that I cleaned and bandaged with the first aid kit from my emergency bag. I looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the person staring back, wild-eyed and pale, with dirt streaked across my face and hands still trembling from adrenaline. I splashed cold water on my face and tried to pull myself together because the children needed me to be stable. When we came out, I bought them snacks and drinks they probably wouldn't eat, but that felt like a gesture toward normalcy. We sat in the truck and picked at food while Elena walked a distance away, phone pressed to her ear and face intense with concentration. She made multiple calls, pacing and gesturing in a way that suggested she was arguing with someone or demanding something. Finally, she came back to the truck and told me she'd reached Gabriel, who was already en route to meet us at the safe house. She'd also contacted law enforcement and reported the attack on the house, though she'd been vague about certain details because of the complexity of Gabriel's work and the need to protect ongoing investigations. She said Vincent's team had sustained casualties, but some had survived and were now secured in a hospital under police protection. Vincent himself was in critical condition but alive, and Gabriel was coordinating with both law enforcement and his private security contacts to identify the attackers and determine how they'd found the house and breached multiple layers of security. Elena's voice was steady when she relayed this information, but I could see tears tracking down her face that she didn't bother to wipe away. We drove for 6 more hours, stopping only once more for gas and bathroom breaks, pushing through into the evening and then night. The children dozed fitfully in the back seat while I stayed awake to help Elena maintain alertness and watch for any sign of pursuit. We talked quietly about what would happen next. They'd need to relocate again, obviously, but Gabriel was pushing for official witness protection this time, rather than continuing to manage security privately. The attack had been too sophisticated and too well-informed, suggesting someone inside their security apparatus had been compromised, or their communications had been penetrated at a level that made private protection inadequate. Elena said she was tired of running, and tired of watching her children grow up afraid, and maybe it was time to accept the restrictions of official protection if it meant they could actually be safe. We reached the safe house after midnight, a nondescript property in a rural area that looked like thousands of other middle-class homes. Gabriel was already there, waiting in the driveway as we pulled up, and the children burst from the truck and ran to him before Elena had fully stopped. He caught them all in his arms and held them while they cried and tried to talk all at once about what had happened. Elena sat in the driver's seat for a long moment before getting out, and when she did, Gabriel pulled her into the embrace with the children, and they stood there as a family unit holding each other while I gave them privacy and tried to process the events of the past 12 hours that felt like an entire lifetime compressed into impossible intensity. Gabriel eventually came over to me and shook my hand with a grip that was firm and warm, and he thanked me for protecting his family and getting them out safely. He said Elena had briefed him on everything I'd done, and he understood I'd gone far beyond what anyone could reasonably expect from a nanny. He wanted me to know they'd compensate me appropriately, and if I wanted to continue with them through whatever came next, they'd be honored to have me. But he'd also understand completely if I needed to walk away from the chaos their lives represented. I looked at the 3 children who'd survived today because of drills and preparation, and adults who'd sacrificed to buy them escape time, and I told Gabriel I wasn't going anywhere. Those kids needed stability and consistency, and I'd promised Lucia I wouldn't leave without warning, and I intended to keep that promise no matter how complicated things got. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.